This review and analysis of Resident Evil 7 will contain full spoilers for the main story and additional content, with exception of the Not a Hero DLC, which hasn't been released at the time of producing this video. It goes without saying that if you wish to experience the game as the developers likely intended, then I recommend you do not watch this video prior to playing the game. For those of you that are curious, I will say that Resident Evil 7 is a good game, and well worth playing. This review will feature me critiquing some plot holes in the main story that might be addressed with the forthcoming DLC, and whilst I could have waited until its release to see if those plot holes are resolved, I wanted to get this review done sooner rather than later. If the DLC does address several issues I highlight, then I'll make a follow-up video to examine how this new information affects the narrative as a whole. Most people who have consumed media in the modern day will likely be familiar with the Resident Evil name to some degree, be it via the games like myself or the questionable movie franchise it later spawned. After Resident Evil 4, the game series has been slowly on the decline in terms of identity, becoming something more akin to a third-person spectacle shooter rather than the survival horror it established itself as being from its inception. Although I'd say Resident Evil 4 also wasn't in the survival horror category, its fresh new direction in gameplay that allowed players more control over their character and environment managed to be fun and engaging while still retaining the overall feel of the series that fans had come to expect, and so was received very well for the innovation it brought to the table. After RE4, the series has been increasingly criticized by the fans and gaming press alike, exacerbated more by the release of some incredibly lackluster spin-off titles, and so has been suffering commercially as a result. The latest incarnation of the series looks to address this by going back to its roots. For this reason, it is tempting to make comparisons to previous iterations of the franchise, but I'm not going to do that here. Instead, I will look to judge this game primarily on what it looks to achieve as its own survival horror game, first and foremost. So, with all that said, let's get to it. The game is set in the same time period of its real-world release in early 2017. It opens with two brief video messages from a woman whom we learn soon after to be the protagonist's missing wife. The first video is normal, the second a dramatic change of tone and atmosphere, with the wife now in a distressed state and warning her husband to stay away without any hint of why. 3 years later, the protagonist, Ethan Winters, receives an email from his missing wife asking him to come get her from an address in Louisiana. The game begins upon arrival at this address. The opening sequence is not overly long or intrusive and leaves everything about the situation very vague, a good start that doesn't overstay its welcome, which is exactly what we want from this kind of genre. Upon gaining control of Ethan, the one obvious and huge change to the gameplay compared to previous titles is the shift to a first-person perspective. This is the first time this has been done with any of the main numbered titles, and it remains this way for the entirety of the game. I found the first-person perspective to be a suitable fit for what they were looking to achieve with the atmosphere, and so I believe this was the right decision to make. Upon arriving, the player explores around the compound of the house trying to find a way inside, leading them to find evidence confirming that the protagonist's wife is indeed there, and then to a seemingly abandoned guest house to look for further clues. The sound design in the guest house is great, and there was enough variation of creaking, cracking and bumps happening in the house around me to keep me tense and nervous that something might be watching, but not so many that I became immune to the effect after a short time. It was generally done very well. After a little exploring, a VHS tape is found belonging to the film crew of an abandoned van you found outside earlier. This is an introduction to the illogical but forgivable method that Resident Evil 7 uses to show the player past events that occurred around the house. But it makes absolutely no sense that any VHS recording device would be used in recent years, especially by a professional film crew and even more so by Mia and Clancy, whom the player could be forgiven for thinking they have a giant VHS camcorder stuck to their heads the entire time you watch their tapes. Compact cassette tapes are used in the Madhouse difficulty to save your game, but the inclusion of them is far more believable in the context of the situation and location, much like the typewriters and ink ribbons of the older titles. The only logical reason I could think of for their existence that might fit into the game world is Lucas taking the footage and converting it into VHS using some kind of software. The theme of the game was also stated to be inspired from the Evil Dead movies, so a VHS tape would match that vintage feel. In spite of their questionable existence, they successfully suit the aesthetics of the game, and so were not a deal-breaker for me. Another small but noteworthy addition is that the player is able to control whomever was recording the footage at the time, allowing them to feel more involved while simultaneously giving them a chance to become more familiar with the environment and all the puzzles, which the game utilizes very well later on when the player can use the footage to skip steps of a puzzle gauntlet which would otherwise have killed them. After using the tape to learn of a secret door, the player eventually stumbles across Mia locked in a cell in the basement. The interaction between them is somewhat awkward, and Ethan in particular seems incredibly unemotional even though he's just found his wife, whom has been presumed dead for the last 3 years. I know if I was him, I would certainly have some questions and likely refuse to continue on until she gave me a good idea of what the hell happened to her. That being said, Mia's facial animations are very good, and Katie O'Hagan puts in a good voice performance, as does the rest of the cast in general. The script was nothing remarkable, but I never felt the voice performances were out of place with the atmosphere. After leading you around, Mia is seemingly kidnapped, and you're left to explore a little before backtracking to stumble upon her once again, where you're introduced to her alter ego. It's at this point RE7 shows its true colors and ramps up significantly from subtle tension building to outright shock horror, and does so in a glorious way, at least for those with the uncensored version. I found this change of tone to be very effective, as subjecting the player to such a sudden extreme change might cause them to panic and can help put them into Ethan's shoes. I also want to give praise to the facial and movement animations of Mia, which really helped to sell the moment. After a scuffle with Mia, the player is introduced to Zoe via a phone call, who tells them how to escape, even though we later discover she wants the player to stick around to help free her family and clean up their mess. Mia is encountered again, who then asks the player for a hand before moving to the attic for a final encounter. The player then manages to find a gun in the attic, which allows them to finally gain the upper hand.
Okay, fine.
I suspect the attic fight with Mia was likely the first time many players experienced their first death. I myself was caught more than once by Mia's sudden lunges and treated to an absolutely brutal death scene. This eventually taught me to pick and time my shots and not be too brazen, a lesson I suspect the developers wanted to instill within the player early on to not waste their ammo, as the main enemies are all bullet sponges if shot anywhere but the head. After the fight, Jack then appears and welcomes the player back to the main house, where they are fitted with a watch and treated to dinner with the family. Like many others, I had been spoiled of the Baker family's existence prior to playing the game, but the impact of their introduction was still very strong and engrossing. Although short, the scene is very well directed, motion-capped and voice-acted, leading to very believable and genuinely disturbing characters. Jack Brand and Jesse Pimentel in particular give very strong performances as Jack and Lucas throughout the game. After dinner ends, the game kicks in proper and a flow of exploration, light puzzle solving, hide and seek and combat begins.
My little Ethan.
I was pleased to see the return of a much slower and deliberate pace to the series that emphasizes exploration above all else. The puzzles and locked doors' existence were justified thanks to the inclusion of Lucas's character, who we come to learn has a perverse fascination with such things, and the game goes out of its way to show how many of them were built years prior to the game's plot. Sadly though, these puzzles won't test the player's intelligence in the slightest. Even though you can use all of your items for the shadow puzzles, the player is never encouraged to try this, as it is obvious which item is the correct one to use. I would like to have seen more obscurity with which was the correct choice, or even multiple items that could have worked to allow the player to proceed, rewarding experimentation. With exception of an optional outdoor puzzle, which is more vague, the way the shadow puzzles currently function is no different to using a specific marked key for a specific marked door. The birthday gauntlet is a little better and requires more logical thought and experimentation from the player, but sadly this usage wasn't repeated anywhere else in the main game. First escaping Jack and arriving in the laundry room, the player is able to find a herb and chem fluid which allows them to make use of the combining mechanic for the first time. The item box to store excess items makes a return, subtly communicating that item management will need to be a consideration, as is the ability to examine areas of the environment for additional exposition. The developers also placed an examinable box in a prominent location next to the door, to reinforce that it can be beneficial for items to be checked thoroughly if their use is not already immediately apparent. This is an action that is mandatory for the player if they are able to progress later through the game. Up to now, with all the examinable items that can be found, it's clear the developers did the best they could to convey this mechanic short of forcing the player to do so through some kind of mandatory event with tutorial prompts. I'm very grateful they did it this way, as it isn't a difficult mechanic to work out, but it still requires the player to possess a level of curiosity and intelligence to progress, without obnoxiously treating them like an idiot at the same time. The whole room basically serves as a means of communicating that this Resident Evil has been crafted very much in the spirit of its roots. Soon after, Ethan gets stuck in the garage with Jack and is forced to find a way to kill or immobilize him. The encounter can only end one way, but how the player gets there can differ depending on their timings. Either they will use the car or Jack will. I appreciated the existence of this dynamic event, although I found the scenario in which Jack gets the car to be a little bit too punishing. It's very difficult to avoid if you don't know what to do, and it took so long for him to stop that I almost restarted my save, thinking that I was maybe supposed to die, but I had just found a way to overcome the AI. But eventually he did stop, and things continued as normal. Perhaps I'm being overly generous to the developers, but this could be an intentionally difficult and prolonged situation, as so to encourage the player to be careful when they take action, which is going against how we've been conditioned by many modern games, that scripted events normally give us some kind of invulnerability to harm. Either way, it forces the player to be more considerate, which is only a good thing in my books. Soon after solving the first puzzle, you're introduced to the main enemy type of the game, the Molded. Although for those that had played the demo before release of the main game, this would not be the first time meeting them. The introduction literally comes out of nowhere and lacks any kind of fanfare or build-up of tension. I'm torn on whether this was a good decision, and I wonder if it was done this way because the developers assumed most players would have played the demo prior, and so didn't bother to reintroduce the Molded in any meaningful or interesting way. Even if that is the case, I still think the Molded could have used a little more fanfare to make them more memorable for the player. From what I've heard and read of other reviews, the main criticism of RE7 has been the lacking variety of enemy types, of which there are currently 6. This criticism seems to be towards the 4 Molded types, so I'm going to focus on them for a moment. There's nothing much to say about the big bugs and the swarm of flies, as the concept and their execution is entirely unremarkable. The 4 types of Molded are the Standard one, the Stronger Standard one, the Fast Crawling one, and the Fat Vomiting one. I personally don't have a problem with there only being 4 types, and I think the issue that caused their negative reception lies primarily in their behavior. I make this point because in the first section of the game you're hunted by Jack, whom is only one person. However, no one complained about this lack of variety because his dynamic behavior and personality made him compelling and interesting enough to keep his encounters engaging and tense. With exception of their visual design, the Molded are devoid of any kind of personality and dynamic behavior outside of their programmed attacks, and said attacks are just variations of lunging at the player. They will usually attack in the same way, respond to attacks in the same way, and must be defeated in the same way. The Fat one in particular was completely unenjoyable for me to fight. It's just a bullet sponge that vomits everywhere and has a charge attack that looks more like a brisk walk, making it very jarring when Ethan is thrown back by an animation that appears to have no such force behind it. The vomit also clips through solid objects and could sometimes still damage me, giving no clear indication of which cover was safe and increasing the frustration of the encounter. If the developers had taken the time to add more complex behaviors and even some scripted sequences to the Molded encounters, then it would have gone a long way to make them feel more threatening and interesting. A little more backstory and detail about the changing process from human to Molded, or even meeting others in the process of changing, would also have helped. I don't feel criticizing their visual design is productive, as they're just pure black mold, and I personally can't see any other ways they might have made them interesting, considering the limitation of the theme. After making your way to the basement, which for some reason has a fully functioning morgue in it, there is an enjoyable final confrontation with Jack in his human form. The player then gets outside of the house and now has to deal with Marguerite, Jack's wife, and is guided by Zoe to do so. While not implicitly showing it, the game follows a very standard zone or chapter setup. The first is Jack's, the second is Marguerite's, the third is Lucas's, the fourth is Evelyn's, each with a section of the environment devoted entirely to them. I've no problem with this setup, although upon reflection it would have been good to see the family interact with each other more during the main plot and perhaps even have worked together in some way to try and stop the player. As it currently stands, the only time you'll see them together is during the earlier dinner scene and in the Daughters DLC. Marguerite's section follows a similar pattern of gameplay to Jack's. You sneak around her, solve a shadow puzzle, and eventually face her in an arena. Her transformed visual design was suitably disgusting. The sound of her birthing bug hives along the walls and a bug hive growing from her crotch area, which is also simultaneously her weak point, was enough to make me cringe while playing. And even as I write this paragraph at the thought of it. I found the fight itself to be lackluster, however. At the beginning, it's set up in a way to create paranoia for the player, as they're given the impression they could be attacked from any direction at any time. But the truth is, while this can occur at a few set locations, Marguerite's AI just wasn't quite up to the task of matching this expectation, often getting confused about which direction to move when retreating from the player especially. It was quite easy to track her the entire time, and the pauses between her movements were long enough to give me the impression of the AI calculating what set point to move to before moving in to attack me again, and in the end put me into a formulaic mindset which removed any feeling of tension from the experience. It's by no means a bad boss fight, it just wasn't particularly memorable for me. After defeating Marguerite, the player now has the ability to claim an ingredient for a serum, and is next introduced to Evelyn in a simple but effective horror sequence which ends up raising an unanswered question that I will deal with later in the video. After this, the player expects to finally meet Zoe, but has their expectations subverted by Lucas, who now has his turn to take on Ethan. The player learns more of Lucas's motivations before having to make it through a gauntlet of traps. Lucas reveals he's holding Mia and Zoe hostage, and is also in possession of the head required to synthesize the serum, and remarks upon how he doesn't wish to go back to being a regular human. He taunts the player to try and make it through his traps, and that is their only way to obtain the last ingredient to save the girls. At this stage of the game, the section makes a nice change of pace from the hide-and-seek mentality of his parents, but the gauntlet itself is relatively simplistic, mainly comprising of explosive tripwires in plain sight and some hidden inside crates that did manage to catch me out a couple of times. If it's your first playthrough, then this will be the first time to encounter the fat vomiting Molded. I will admit I died during this first encounter due to not being sure how to deal with his vomiting, and I retreated upstairs, which resulted in me ultimately trapping myself without any cover. This encounter was the first time I felt justified using the grenade launcher on a non-boss enemy, which until that moment seemed to be overkill for anything but the bosses. After next making it through the birthday gauntlet with previous knowledge of codes from the VHS tape, the player obtains the final ingredient and then reaches Mia and Zoe. Zoe magically materializes 2 syringes of serum from a blender before Jack intervenes for one last hurrah. I've little to say about the boss, as just by looking at the footage alone it's not hard to work out how he's defeated. For myself, the fight felt quite contrived and was nothing more than padding rather than an engaging fight. The main point of the boss is to create an excuse to use up a serum that then forces the player to choose between curing either Mia or Zoe. This might be the only time I say I would have preferred an interactive cutscene to get to this plot point rather than the uninspired formulaic boss fight I got. What follows shortly afterward is the game's first and only moral choice presented to the player. I've specifically avoided using the term branching choice here for a reason, and I will explain why later. When first presented with the choice of who to cure, I stopped for a moment and thought about the history of the characters and how they had behaved during the plot of the game, and also how Ethan might have felt in light of all that's happened, and also how I felt as a player who had experienced the characters personally. As we learn at the beginning of the game, Mia is Ethan's wife, which seems to be reason enough to choose her for the majority of the discussions about this I've watched on playthroughs of the game. However, for me as a somewhat logical-minded man, this reason alone was absolutely not enough. So I thought about how Mia had been missing for 3 years and left her bewildered husband with nothing more than a message telling him to stay away. I can imagine within this space of time, Ethan may certainly still be sensitive about the topic of her missing, but would also likely have come to terms with continuing on his life without her. So, upon finding her at last, she spurns Ethan's advances, seems not to want him around, and later proceeds to stab him multiple times. She impales a screwdriver through his hand and then cuts off said hand with a chainsaw. She even openly admits lying to Ethan about something important in the opening movie of the game. I'm aware her intentions may have been sound, and she clearly wasn't in full control of herself during these events, but actions speak louder than intentions in this case. On the other hand, Zoe guides the player through the house and gives him the necessary information to eventually find the ingredients to make a serum to cure both her and his wife, so they all may escape. Granted, she does these things to further her own agenda, and she does display a general indifference to the player character's suffering. She also certainly could have given Ethan more warning as to what her parents were capable of before taking them on.
Find a serum?
I just got done dealing with your mom and her fucking bugs. Wish you could have warned me.
Sorry about that.
But the point is she never did any wrong or harm to the player and hasn't displayed any intentions or ability to do so. Considering all of these things, the clear choice for me was Zoe. Too much time had passed for Mia and Ethan, and she proved quite clearly she wasn't to be trusted.
Safety, and then I can come back for you.
Go! I don't want to hear it, both of you, just go!
Mia.
Go!
So you can imagine my surprise when Zoe is then killed off moments later and the player then takes control of Mia, who somehow ends up close to the location your boat capsizes, even though she was left behind seemingly a long way back. Playing through the game a second time and choosing Mia results in exactly the same events happening, except Mia is not killed during the capsizing of the boat, and the following section controlling her makes much more sense that she would actually be at the location she ends up in. Zoe is never heard from or seen alive again, and so can only be assumed dead or missing. The fact she appears in Ethan's vision alongside Jack would imply the former. The difference between the choices only boils down to Mia surviving at the end or not, and just slightly alters 2 scenes at the late and end game. The former alteration being that you just have to kill her one last time. Regardless of the choice you make, everything that happens between those scenes assume that you chose Mia, so the choice itself ends up being quite pointless and arbitrary, and I was incredibly disappointed to discover this fact on the second playthrough. If the player decided to choose Zoe, then having the player take control of her on the ship would have allowed her to be fleshed out much more, and the player given the chance to see how the infection has affected her to this point. Mia could have become an extra boss, having fully succumbed to Evelyn's influence after the despair of Ethan not choosing her. This could have been handled in a number of interesting ways, from Mia stalking Zoe through the ship to being a set-piece boss Zoe must kill, perhaps without ever telling Ethan about what happened. It's a shame the developers didn't have the time to more realize this part of the game, instead just lumbering the player with the supposed bad ending for making what I would deem to be quite a logical and reasonable choice considering the circumstances. I in no way believe the developers are satisfied with how these choices play out, and I can only assume they ran out of time before they could implement suitable consequences that were meaningful and appropriately game-changing. Anyway, arbitrary choices aside, the ship section serves as both a reveal for Mia's and Evelyn's backstory. Mia turns out to be an Umbrella employee in charge of taking care of Evelyn, and Evelyn being a new form of bioweapon that has gone out of control. This section also serves to be a throwback to previous games, that is less exposition and more exploration. There are keys to be found, machines to be reactivated, and an admittedly laughably easy puzzle to be solved. And these things are generally achieved through memorization of potential important locations and backtracking to said locations to look for items that may help the player to progress, akin to the older PlayStation 1 era games. This would all be fine for me except for one issue that ground me to a halt, causing me to wander around the ship aimlessly for close to 2 hours with no idea where to find an item. I had to find a fuse to power an elevator. Perhaps my own stupidity is to blame for this, but in the end it turned out I needed to take a fuse I had already used to unlock a previous door and then use that on the elevator. Problem is, up until this point the game had conditioned me to assume that once an item had been used to solve something, then it no longer served another purpose. Of course, with exception of the themed keys that had multiple doors to be used on. Every other puzzle-solving and progress item in the game conformed to this standard up until now, so I had no reason to think otherwise. I only eventually stumbled upon the solution through sheer desperation and luck. I also encountered a similar issue in the bedroom DLC, where the paintings can be used in 2 different combinations, and I was shamefully only made aware of this via a loading screen hint upon retrying the scenario. My own lack of open-mindedness is no doubt partly to blame for this halting of progress, but I do feel some responsibility falls upon the game designers for not communicating this mechanic earlier in the game, so that the idea of reusing an item would have been a consideration for me. I wouldn't have had this problem were I in this kind of situation for real, although to be fair, if this were real I'd likely be cowering in a corner somewhere. But when dealing with games, my mind is used to adhering to the rules and limitations the developers set. If I were to apply real-world logic and reasoning to a game, then it would be impossible to enjoy it, as I would spend all of my time bemoaning why, for example, I couldn't just break one of the many unboarded windows to get outside, or shoot a door open with a gun, rather than subject myself to the horrors in the basement to find the appropriate key items. It's important the developers communicate the rules of the game world clearly, so that they can't be held to blame should the player get stuck, where then the player would only have their lack of comprehension or observation to blame. Anyway, after finding Ethan, the player regains control of him and then must either kill or leave Mia depending on their choice earlier, before then finding themselves at the entrance to a mine. The mine itself is very linear and not very visually interesting. The tripwire traps left behind imply Lucas has been this way also. You then discover via some emails sent by Lucas that he has been free of the mind control aspect of the virus for some time, seemingly with the help of an unknown organization whom he has been reporting to ever since. This leaves a huge question mark about his intentions and whereabouts, which is never resolved by the main story. I can only hope that it is in the Last Story DLC with Chris Redfield. The player then conveniently obtains another serum Lucas was kind enough to leave behind, so they can now use it on Evelyn to kill her, and after proceeding through the mine a little more, the player finds themselves back at the guest house where the game started. At this point, the player should have learnt that Evelyn's umbrella designation is E001, and coming full circle and finding the picture once again of the old woman the player encounters throughout the house with E001 written on the back of it, is a clever way for the player to discover that she was Evelyn the entire time, if they didn't already realize this through the hint given in Lucas's email. After experiencing a few visions that implies Ethan is infected, the player confronts Evelyn and injects her with the serum, mutating her into a giant monster, but is ultimately defeated in what may as well be an interactive cutscene. Then, after being rescued by Chris Redfield in classic Resident Evil style, Ethan flies away by helicopter into the sunset. Mia is with him if you chose her, and the dialogue is slightly altered for the scene. It took me around 10 hours to complete on my first playthrough, and I felt generally very satisfied with the experience in spite of the flaws I highlighted. There's no denying the game seems quite rushed towards the end, but the overall presentation, art and sound design were excellent and made the world a believable and engrossing place that really sold the survival horror atmosphere. After first completion of the game, the players then unlock Madhouse mode. This increases the challenge of the game by giving the player less ammo, changing the location of some key items, making enemies appear sooner, some of which are also tougher but fewer in numbers, and limiting the player's ability to save by making it a consumable resource, a throwback to the ink ribbon system of the older games. The level designers were kind enough to factor in repeat playthroughs, so time can be saved with prior knowledge of what needs to be done, and some parts of the areas can be skipped entirely with the rejigged item placement. Unfortunately, by the midway point of the story, the game abandons these more interesting changes in favor of just making the enemies hit harder and increasing their numbers in some places. This is a great shame, and further evidence the developers were likely pressed for time towards the end of the development cycle. I can only speak for myself, but I'm sick of higher difficulty levels in games mainly consisting of making the player more fragile and the enemies hit harder. The gaming medium has been around long enough now that many people are greatly experienced in playing games, so these damage modifiers are utterly boring and lazy at this point. What would be more interesting for me, and quite necessary at this stage in gaming's life, is to have enemies behave much more intelligently and exhibit much stronger behaviors for self-preservation. Before I give my closing conclusion, I want to take some time to talk about the banned footage DLC and how a part of it affects the main story in both positive and negative ways. Banned Footage 1 contained the Nightmare, Bedroom, and Ethan Must Die scenarios. Nightmare is an enemy wave attack scenario which takes place in the basement of the house. You play as Clancy Jarvis, the cameraman from the news crew in the first VHS tape, and you must survive until dawn against increasingly difficult waves of enemies. You use machines to process scraps which can then be used as a currency to buy weapons, ammo, and perks to survive. You can also use this currency to activate and upgrade sentries and traps throughout the environment, and also to unlock doors to expand the play environment. It functions fine for what it is, but would have been better, of course, if the molded were more interesting to fight. In Bedroom, you play as Clancy once again, who has been captured and confined to bed by Marguerite, who wishes to feed him some delicious home cooking which we can only assume will cause him to be infected.
Oh God, I love home cooking.
The goal of this scenario is to find a way to escape the room without Marguerite catching you in the act. You do this by replacing all moved items to their original location when she comes back to check on you. I found this scenario to be a wonderful addition to the game that perfectly fit the atmosphere. The concept itself was novel and refreshing for me, and contained the only part of the game to leave me scratching my head for a while at a puzzle before kicking myself at finding out the solution, which it turned out was being subtly shown to me the whole time. If anything, I think it could be made more tense and punishing by making the player have to pay attention to Marguerite's footsteps to know when to get back into bed, rather than the obvious audio cue and timer that flashes on the screen. Ethan Must Die is an ultra-difficult scenario which pits the player against overwhelming odds to make it through the main house to ultimately get the key to the greenhouse and kill Marguerite. The twist to this mode is that you start off with only a knife and must rely on a random number generator to give you supply crates that contain more weapons, ammunition, and support items. Enemies are abundant and severely wound or outright kill the player in one hit. Traps are littered throughout your path, and death results in the player restarting the entire thing from scratch and at the mercy of the RNG once more. I began playing this mode eager for a challenge, and I got one, just not the good kind of challenge in my opinion. It's pure attrition and nothing more. Skill has no bearing on this mode, as the game delights in killing you over and over again, with the only means of progress being trial and error by death, remembering what happens, and then hoping you're lucky enough to be given the right weapon with enough ammo to deal with these situations. Unfair doesn't even begin to describe this mode, and this seems to be exactly what the developers were going for, and I'm really not sure why. As I write this paragraph, I originally planned to go into a rant about how player satisfaction is best gained from using their skill, wits, and cunning to overcome a challenge, rather than relying on a dice roll and trial and error. But I realize there are others who will certainly enjoy this type of attrition, so I'll just conclude by acknowledging that there is an intended audience for this kind of gameplay, and I clearly was not it. I did eventually make it to Marguerite after many hours, teeming with health and weapons, but with very little ammo thanks to the luck of the RNG, so of course I died in the end. As a matter of principle, I wanted to fully complete the game before writing this review, and this mode was the one thing preventing me doing so sooner. In the end, I forsook my principle, watched a completion video on YouTube to make sure I wouldn't miss anything that might change my mind about how I feel, and after confirming it was as anticlimactic as I thought, I gave up and began writing. I absolutely hated the mode in the end, and did not enjoy the time spent with it. Banned Footage 2 brought the 21, Daughters, and Jack's 55th birthday scenarios. 21 is simply a game of blackjack with a twist, and I found this to be surprisingly fun and addictive. The addition of trump cards that modify the state of play kept it sufficiently interesting for me. I particularly liked how the game uses only 11 cards and not a standard deck, so the player is able to quite easily employ mathematical probability and deduction to predict their opponent's hidden card. Some of the trump cards even indirectly supported this method of play, so the developers clearly had it in mind for the player to do this. Jack's 55th birthday has you playing as Mia and running around various environments finding food to feed Jack before the timer expires. It's as silly as it sounds, and whilst I didn't care much for it, I still appreciated its light-hearted tone in stark contrast to the rest of the game. And it's typically Japanese in its delightful silliness, so I wasn't surprised one bit by its inclusion. Daughters has the player take control of Zoe in the moments when Jack finds Evelyn before she infects the entire family, and was by far my favourite inclusion of the DLCs. The opening sequence managed to strike a chord with me emotionally, as in a very short time it manages to convey just how genuinely nice Jack and Marguerite Baker were before they became infected. Jack in particular comes across as an upstanding, kind-hearted man, and the interaction between him, his wife, and Zoe portray this very efficiently. So credit must go to the writers, the voice actors, and the animators for accomplishing this in a very short time. So when the moment comes that Zoe finds Jack infected, the stark contrast in personality manages to carry more emotional weight behind it, thanks to those earlier scenes. Going back into the main game after seeing the Bakers in a normal light helped to enhance the experience by adding that sense of tragedy and pity to the mix. Whilst I would deem the daughter scenario to be an overall success in adding depth to the Baker family, it also manages to undermine the main story in two ways. In the main game, when the player gets to Grandma's room, they find a letter from a doctor addressed to a Mrs. Baker, detailing concerns about a strange infection spreading throughout her body. The existence of this letter implies that after being infected, this particular Mrs. Baker possessed enough control and self-awareness over a period of time long enough to recognize something was wrong with her, and to go and see a doctor about it. For a first-time player, this is naturally assumed to be the mute old lady they encounter across the house due to the location of the letter being Grandma's room. However, as we eventually discover, the old lady is actually a rapidly aged Evelyn. If there was a grandmother living with the family at some point, then the daughter scenario confirms she was not around preceding the events of the game, and it would make no sense for Evelyn to go and see a doctor considering she seems aware of what she is and doesn't have a problem with it. As the title used in the letter is Mrs., we can rule out Zoe, as she is not implied to be married or in a romantic relationship with anyone, and would very likely not be living with her parents if she were married. That only leaves Marguerite as the recipient of the letter, but as the daughter scenario shows, the infection took almost full control of her within a minute, with bugs already infesting her body. She manages to resist for a short time thereafter, but that only lasts for several seconds. These events directly contradict the implication of the letter that suggests the infection took gradual control over a longer period of time, and it's hard to believe that Marguerite would have regained clarity for long enough to go and see a doctor. And even if she somehow did, she displays an awareness of being possessed, so any rational mind would realize that seeing a doctor probably wouldn't help this. In a game that is far heavier on exposition than its predecessors, that relies on this to immerse the player, the developers need to be more careful not to let such contradictions undermine the narrative. The second issue for me were the requirements to gain the true ending for the daughter scenario. The scenario itself is far more focused on narrative than it is gameplay, and the player enters this with the expectation of experiencing these moments firsthand. All of the plot advancements are done through in-game cutscenes, and the player is given clear instructions on how to proceed through the story by the character's dialogue, and is led by linear set pieces all the way to the end. Only then to be told that they failed to lead Zoe on the true path. I have a problem with this, because the notion the player failed in some way implies that they were given the opportunity to do things correctly but were unable. However, for a first-time playthrough, this is simply not possible, and it suffers from the same problem as Ethan Must Die often does, in that it forces the player to fail without giving them a fair chance to use their intelligence to find the correct solution beforehand. To gain the true ending, the player must use a lockpick to open a drawer in the bathroom that contains a button used to get into the attic above the kids' room. They then read a note stating that the password to access the computer is the same as the one to access Zoe's phone. Being that you're playing as Zoe, your character should know the password, but of course the player does not, and the only time a phone is ever seen is in Lucas's hand. After the scene where Jack finds Evelyn has played out, you can't interact with him to ask for the passcode, so you're forced to restart the whole scenario and then watch Lucas input the password after he sits down. and it should be noted the player only ever has one chance to do this. After gaining access to the computer, you read a message left by Lucas and learn his things have been stored away in a red box on the balcony. Upon later finding this box, you get the dog's head to go outside to the caravan where you find Mia and the ingredients to the serum before Evelyn stops you and then the scenario ends. This, apparently, is the true path Zoe took before the events of the game. Now, I will admit that I initially enjoyed the obscure process required to obtain the true ending, but the more I thought about it afterwards, the more it detracted from the overall experience for me. If that is indeed Zoe's true path, which is canon to the story, then that means the obscure actions the player makes her take are completely immersion-shattering to the story, as no person would behave as she does under those circumstances. You could argue I'm taking the story a little too seriously, especially since it's a Resident Evil title, and you may well be correct. But my rebuttal to this accusation would be that the story generally takes itself far more seriously when compared to previous titles. And for the psychological horror setting the game is going for to work well, the world and its inhabitants need to behave in believable and relatable ways. To conclude on the DLC, with exception of the daughter scenario, the content felt like it should have been included with the game upon release, and I agree with the other complaints that the overall cost of the Season Pass was not priced reasonably. I think the mini-scenarios should have been included with the game or came free later, and they should only have charged for the story DLC. Or of course, in an ideal and less greedy world, all of it should have come with the main game to begin with. Although I've gone into some detail about the game's faults during this review, my overall time spent with Resident Evil 7 was very enjoyable, and I consider the game a success at what it set out to do. I went in looking for a horror experience that understood the importance of subtlety to create tension, and for the most part that's what I got. The developers really seem to understand how crucial a believable atmosphere and subtle sound effects are to effective psychological horror, and I was pleased to find this attention to detail extended throughout the majority of the game. For example, the simple yet distinctive mechanical clunk of the larger weapons that occurred with every footstep your character took was one of the most memorable sound effects for me. The game's executive producer, Jun Takeuchi, was quoted saying he wanted this iteration of the series to be stripped down to its core, and this philosophy is quite evident throughout the game. The attention to detail put into the interior environments of the house especially is something that needs to be highlighted and commended. Many games of this genre released in the past simply have not placed enough emphasis on building a believable world for the player to lose themselves in. It's clear a lot of care and attention was put into the small details of the art design. Many times whilst playing, I stopped just to admire the environment and could imagine how the artists and level designers deliberated on how and why the foliage, dilapidation, and debris would even exist in the world. It all felt like it had a history, and so was all very believable. The shift to a first-person viewpoint was a wise move in my opinion, and contributed greatly towards making the experience feel far more personal. However, I couldn't help but wonder how impactful this change of perspective might have been on me if I hadn't seen any promotional footage or press articles prior to the game's release. And I lamented on how the internet makes it near impossible to avoid information about these things. The new perspective would likely have subverted my expectations, but in a very positive way, and immersed me even more, at least for the opening hours until I got used to it. The story is generally quite good, but it suffers from several illogical circumstances and behaviors from characters that made it a little difficult to suspend disbelief. For example, how did Zoe seem to know Ethan's location at all times to call him? Why would Evelyn leave a corpse that can provide part of the cure to her own virus intact behind her bedroom? Why did Lucas not just destroy the serum ingredient after using it as bait to lure the player through his traps? Considering he appears to like the infection, it seems rather moronic that he would let a potential cure be available to compromise his intentions. And lastly, why and how is there a fully functioning morgue in the basement of a house located at a plantation? I can't think of any good reason for this to be the case. None of these were enough to sour me on the experience, but they did leave me scratching my head and questioning them during the playthrough. In spite of the game's overall praise from fans and press, I've read some criticism from people saying the game is too disconnected from its predecessors, no doubt mainly due to the completely new cast of characters featured, excluding Chris of course. I think this is an understandable but somewhat unfair critique to level on the developers. Pretty much all of the reoccurring characters throughout the series' lifespan have been fighting biological weapons of many incarnations for many years, and thus would very likely be hardened and desensitized to the type of horror featured in RE7. I personally would find it hard to justify Chris and Claire Redfield, Leon Kennedy, or Jill Valentine becoming overly fearful at the prospect of walking through a dark house fighting a few grotesque abominations, alongside hostile and regenerating infected people, especially considering their combat experience with these types of things already, and at much larger scales than is featured in this game. It wouldn't really have been believable, so the developers quite rightly opted for a fresh cast instead to justify the fearful and cautious behavior one lacking these experiences might exhibit in the game scenario. They went for what makes sense for the setting, and I don't think it's fair to criticize them for not using the veteran characters. The writing of the Resident Evil series has been the butt of jokes for many years, and there is no denying it has earned that reputation. However, the cheesiness the past writing and voice delivery contained had a certain endearing charm to it, and that charm has become a part of the series in many ways. I was a very young boy when I first played the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1. It scared me enough that I used to run around my house hiding from make-believe zombies, and the unforgettable somber opening of the Moonlight Sonata that Rebecca Chambers played on the piano would consequently haunt me in my very young dreams. I've come a long way since then, and Resident Evil has also come a long way since Jill sandwiches and right hands coming off. We all have to grow up sometime, and Resident Evil 7 is the first game in the main series that manages to show it has matured past its heritage while still retaining a few silly lines of dialogue. Sadly, some gamers and hardcore fans never quite manage to grow up and will irrationally judge the game because it dares to change the formula and not conform to the expectations of the past that they hold so dear. And it seems they never bother to take the time to examine how the game performs on its own merits. I'm speaking primarily of the type of gamers who will send death threats to reviewers that don't score a game to their expectations. Change can be good or bad. In Resident Evil 7's case, I believe it to be good, much needed in fact. As with all things in life, if experienced too much, we can become fatigued with it and begin desiring different forms of stimuli. Resident Evil 4 offered this change successfully, but the concept became stale by the 6th installment, losing much of its core identity in the process. Now, RE7 looks to replicate that successful change and seems to have done so with a very strong and much more mature entry. All we can really do as humans is hope to learn from our mistakes in history. Time can only tell if Capcom lets the success of this title get to their collective heads and ultimately end up overdoing the concept once again in years to come, prompting another change in format. For future iterations, I do hope the series still manages to find a way to retain some of its silly charm, just not so at the detriment of its main narrative, and if so, should be relegated to optional side events separate from the main story. For now, though, this new form of evil for the series is a welcome resident in my home, and well worth the experience for anyone who is a fan of the genre in general.